So I'm Noah Maturko. I'm HEAL Utah's Senior Policy Associate. My issue area is mostly energy, but I try to help out in air quality and radioactive and nuclear issues while I can. I've been with HEAL about 4.5 years. I started as an organizer, so I've hopefully met a lot of you out there in the audience today, and thanks for joining. Pass it off to Grace.
Yeah, hi everyone, Grace Olskamp. I've been at HEAL Utah for about 3 years now. I am currently a policy associate, but I originally started actually as communications associate, which is how many of you probably know me in that capacity. And super excited that everyone's joined today. He's running the back end right now, so I won't make him turn his camera on or anything, but we do have a new communications associate, Mace Gonzalez, who's running the show and being our IT person today.
Good afternoon. I'm Turner Bitten. I'm the development director here at HEAL, and you'll hear a little bit more from me in just a little bit.
So I'm just going to give a little background about HEAL for those of you who may not be that familiar with us. HEAL's been around for about 20 years. Started working on toxic waste exposures out in the West Desert in Tooele County. That evolved into a focus on radioactive waste issues, primarily with what's now known as energy solutions. And then expanded over the years to include work on air quality and clean energy and climate. So those are the three things we work on. We try to incorporate principles of environmental justice into all of our campaigns because, as we know and are becoming more and more aware, the burdens of these pollution issues are borne disproportionately by more disadvantaged populations, low income and ethnic populations. We have a very strong board of 10 members who represent expertise from across the spectrum. We have 7 people on our staff and about 20,000 supporters in our database who not only support us financially, but respond to our action alerts to contact public officials about the policy issues we're working on. So go to the next slide, Mesa, if you would. So I'll hand it off to Noah.
Great, thanks for that intro, Scott. So like I mentioned, Noah Maturko. I'll give us a quick overview about why we work on energy and climate. So we're talking about energy and climate as two sides of one campaign due to the contribution of carbon pollution from Utah's energy sector. Carbon pollution is the largest contributor to climate change. It's emitted from a wide range of sources, from our homes all the way to large coal plants. And in Utah, energy generation is the largest contributor of our carbon and other greenhouse gas pollutants. So Utah still gets more than 70% of its electricity from coal plants, despite national trends in electricity generation, which are demonstrating decreasing dependence on coal across the US. And that's what this helpful graph is for. That shows how coal is sort of losing its prominence nationally. But that's not necessarily being reflected in Utah. According to their own website, Rocky Mountain Power still generates about 75% of its electricity from burning coal and natural gas. So that's a lot of reliance on fossil fuels. So to combat climate change, a transition to renewable energy must be made. This transition should be made both on the personal level, which means things like more energy efficiency in our homes, and on an industry-wide scale, which is the transition to renewable resources of electric power, and at the heart of what we're talking about today. So the communities most impacted by this transition are our rural communities that have been reliant on either coal extraction or generation in one way or another for generations. So they need to be prioritized for reinvestment and new jobs and economic opportunities. So of course, as most of you may know, when these dirty fossil fuels are burned, they emit carbon dioxide into the air, and that traps heat near the Earth's surface. Climate change adversely impacts all parts of the environment, from wildlife and ecosystems to water and weather, and of course that can have really dire impacts on humanity. So industrial facilities that burn fossil fuels, like our large coal plants here in Utah, also contribute to our air quality problems by polluting the air around them. And we'll go more into that specifically later in our in the issue brief discussing regional haze. And climate change is worsening droughts and extreme weather events, both of which hold serious consequences for our health and safety. And you can, unfortunately, it seems like you can turn on the news any day of the year now and you can see evidence of that. But on a global scale, other connections between climate change and human health include decreased volume and nutritional value of food, heat-related illnesses such as dehydration and heat stroke, and also vector-borne diseases, malaria and Lyme disease. So vulnerable populations around the world and here in Utah are at a higher risk for climate change related health threats. And if Maysay, you could bring it to the next slide. So, so why does HEAL work on this issue and how do we do it? So our efforts to combat climate change center around Utah's transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's of course not all we do on the issue, but that's sort of the heart of where it started. So to do this, we target changes in industry practices, legislative and regulatory policy, and individual choices and behaviors, sort of to a lesser extent, but also keeping that as a part of the equation. We can collaborate with Utah's utilities when possible to find areas of agreement where we can develop realistic pathways to a cleaner future. And we depend on the public to pressure utilities to supply more renewable energy and less dirty energy. Our work within the energy industry relies on independent technical energy modeling. So this modeling, which we sometimes conduct in-house, but we get a much more thorough job when we contract with independent resources and analysts whose really full-time job is doing this stuff. So that can show how generating renewable energy will benefit the utility, the state, the environment, and the ratepayer, which is all of us. So with legislators and regulators, we encourage innovative evidence-based policies that will increase renewable energy development while transitioning away from fossil fuel generation. Our efforts with decision makers focus on economic gains for the state, the employment sector, and ratepayers that renewable energy can bring, as well as the health benefits that come from mitigating climate change. So we seek to ensure communities affected in the transition, like I mentioned earlier, coal communities, places like Carbon and Emery County, are also consulted and plans for long-term reinvestment are prioritized for them. So if through events like this, community nights, tabling, when we get back to that, and online, we try to educate citizens about the effects of climate change and the connection between health, climate, and energy, while also providing options for people to make individual changes. And that's, we don't limit that to the public. We have to constantly work on our state lawmakers and other elected and unelected officials. So whether it's getting more household appliances that are higher efficiency or installing rooftop solar, we encourage and try to promote changes that will decrease the use of dirty energy. However, of course, not all households can afford to make these appliances or energy generation changes. So that's why we work with the legislator and utilities to support effective programs that will make renewable energy more accessible and affordable to all families in Utah. So the following campaign overview within this afternoon's issue brief will illustrate the work that HEAL has done to help aid this transition, an area that covers everything from the solar on your roof, municipal power goals, and what happens on the federal level. But I think I'm going next anyway. So let's start where we began, and that's covering the coal plants owned by Rocky Mountain Power and the impact they have on our energy transition or lack thereof. So perfect, Maysay, thanks for the slide change. And Rocky Mountain Power, the elephant in the room. They're, of course, our largest utility here in Utah, and their service area covers about 80% of Utahns. Rocky Mountain Power is a business unit of PacifiCorp, which also consists of Pacific Power. So I'll use the terms Rocky Mountain Power and PacifiCorp sort of interchangeably. And so those two, Rocky Mountain Power and PacifiCorp are, Pacific Power are business units of PacifiCorp, and that's owned by Berkshire Hathaway Energy. And you can guess where it goes from there. So lots of money on that side. And it's an investor-owned utility company, and it's a monopoly in its service area, which means that while it's obligated to provide reliable power to customers, at the end of the day, its goal is to gain as much returns as possible for stakeholders. Of most concern in Utah are the Hunter and Huntington coal-fired power plants. located in central Utah's Emery County. If you've ever been down there, it's just beautiful country. These two plants are some of the biggest polluters in the West and aren't scheduled for retirement for decades. So Hunter being scheduled for retirement currently in 2042 and Huntington in 2036. So though this timeline, I would say, may move forward, and we'll know more about that in the next few months, there's definitely the need for accelerated change. And other utilities are showing it can be done. And you may have seen an op-ed that HEAL had posted in the Trib last month, sort of outlining the need for that transition and also highlighting a couple of examples for what other large utilities are doing. So I'll just go through a couple of examples we highlighted. The Northern Indiana Public Service Company has determined that reducing emissions by 90% through 2028 through the transition to renewable energy and battery storage is the option among all sources, and these groups all consider nuclear and things like that. Among all sources, it would result in the lowest cost to its 800,000 customers. And Xcel Energy, which serves 3.3 million customers in 8 states, but we really know them as our as our neighbor over in Colorado. They're on the path to reduce emissions 80% by 2030. And WEC Energy, with 4.5 million customers in 4 states, has committed to reducing its emissions 70% by 2030 and aims to achieve net carbon neutrality by 2050. So a lot of these utilities are on the pathway, or they've made commitments to do so, and there's a lot of work ahead of them. Some of that is straightforward and a lot of it is not, but they're doing the work, and they're doing that because it makes financial sense for them as a utility. They've heard from their ratepayers, and ratepayers should be protected throughout that process from rate shocks and other things like that. But utilities tend to resist the idea of making major operational changes like a full transition to renewable energy, and Rocky Mountain Power's presentations to the Public Service Commission reflect this hesitancy, and they'll sort of speak differently in public because it's not popular when utilities make excuses, but they do. So the utility has made some steps towards clean energy. They've invested in large-scale renewable projects, and under direction of the Utah State Legislature, there's been some municipal-led efforts like the Community Renewable Energy Program, which I think Scott will talk about. But analysts have determined that gradual changes around the margins like these aren't really enough to minimize the damaging effects of climate change. So we need to move faster. But Rocky Mountain Power and Utah don't exist in a vacuum, of course. The grid is an interconnected system of generation, transmission, distribution, and power produced in one area can be consumed far away and vice versa. And states throughout the West have varying policies when it comes to current and future energy generation. We seem to be doing things the Utah way, which in this instance means the wrong way. So for example, West Coast states have, where PacifiCorp has customers, places like Oregon, Washington, and California have policies mandating a transition away from coal and fossil fuels. And some of those policies are pretty aggressive. So this has an impact on Utah because unless PacifiCorp wants to retire some of their plants outright, the power produced by shared coal plants and previously consumed by West Coast customers will continue to go elsewhere. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. And the power produced by shared coal plants that are becoming less economically viable are scheduled to retire ahead of schedule. So there's also the challenges created for states that require coordination in protecting the ratepayers and ensuring reliable power going forward. So there's different things happening on different sides of the grid. So for Utah, at the end of the day, this means, are we bringing more coal consumption as the cost of operating coal either increases or becomes less economically favorable to the alternative of early retirement? Or are we being more proactive? So another component to all of this is a concept that you've likely heard about, but I'll go ahead and dive into it a little bit because it's sort of a baby of ours, and that is securitization. So securitization at its most basic is a financial tool that can help reduce utility debt with low interest bonds secured by ratepayers. So when a utility makes the decision to retire a unit years ahead of schedule, there's risk for ratepayers in the form of a rate shock, and there's risk for utilities in the form of loss in planned revenue. So securitization, which in Utah would need to be passed through legislation, would allow the Public Service Commission to add a monthly non-bypassable charge to ratepayers' monthly bill and authorize the state to distribute a bond to the utility backed by the state. So these two mechanisms provide liquid capital for the utility to invest in new renewable generation, which will be cheaper and long-term better for ratepayers. Even with that non-bypassable charge, the ratepayers' bill will be lower. That's not always, but that's the idea if done correctly. And it'll allow for, like I said, investment to new renewable generation and to allow the utility to recover their investment. So those are three really important things that are the outcome of those two mechanisms. So this is a tool we worked on extensively, and we actually gave it a run at legislation in 2019, and for a few different reasons didn't quite take off, but we're hoping to deploy it once again, either on its own or within an existing process. So long story short, we're pursuing an acceleration of this energy transition through public advocacy and working in various regulatory and state and federal legislative processes. And the energy transition and retirement of coal plants is a very complicated process and should be approached in a holistic manner, we think. So it's helpful to think of everything we discuss here today as fitting into that overarching and long-term goal. So I will pass it off to, I believe, Scott.
Hey, thanks, Noah. Good job. That's a complicated topic that takes a few times to sort of get your arms around it. Well, what we're talking about are the things that HEAL staff is putting most of our time into. Besides the big lift of getting Rocky Mountain Power to agree to retire their coal plants, we've been putting as much time and support as we could into a project that's occurring in Utah right now. And this is one of those projects where the Utah way is really proactive and innovative. Back in 2018, the legislature passed a bill called House Bill 411 that allowed communities that were in the Rocky Mountain Power jurisdiction, service area in Utah, to develop a program that would offer their residents 100% renewable energy service with a separate rate structure that would support that. About 24 cities, I think actually there were 23 that signed on. Now there's now 18 cities that are participating, as big as Salt Lake City and as small as Little Francis, Utah, up in Wasatch County. And there's also 3 counties that signed on: Grand County down where Moab is, Salt Lake, and then Summit County up by Park City. These communities have been meeting ever since then to decide how they could develop a mechanism to offer 100% renewable power to their residents. It's more complicated than you would think because number one, they have to create a program that they all share in. So they all have to agree on how this is going to be done. And there's costs in developing that agreement that they're going to have together. And there's also some shared costs that need to go into it, and just in terms of administrating it, making sure that it all fits within public utilities requirements. And then they all have to notify their residents that their residents have the option to opt out of this if they want and just continue to pay Rocky Mountain Power's standard power rates rather than this separate rate that will be connected to this 100% renewable program. Well, this program is one of the early efforts in the country to allow cities and municipalities to make this choice. And it also will cover about 1/3 of the people in Utah who are in the Rocky Mountain Power service area. So it's a really big initiative, and it's being watched very closely around the country. Well, the communities have been in these discussions now for over a year, and they need to all decide by January, based on what the governance agreement looks like and the rate structure looks like, if they're going to continue to participate and sign the agreement among the communities. And as that's been going on, there have been opponents that have started to surface in some of these communities trying to get the city councils to opt out. Some of this is just based on climate denial. Some of it is based on misinformation that people are going to be required to do something. And some of it is based on people's preferences for how the city uses its budget, even though this is a fairly small amount of money in the big picture, in the sort of, for each community, in the tens of thousands of dollars to for their share of putting this governance agreement and rate structure together. So one of the things that these communities can't really do across their boundaries is move into someone else's jurisdiction and lobby for participation. So for example, Salt Lake City employees can't go over to West Valley City and try to lobby their city council to stay in the program. And so this is where HEAL and its grassroots network comes in. We've been participating in these discussions as observers. We've been watching which communities are having second thoughts. We've been listening and identifying the opponents. And we've been trying to make sure that accurate information is getting to these decision makers in these cities and counties, and that they all stay in the program. And so this has consumed a fair amount of our time because of how many municipalities are involved, but we think it's an important priority in demonstrating the viability of 100% renewable energy electricity service. And so we're hopeful that by January, all of the communities decide to stay in, and that after that, this goes forward and is a good demonstration project of how this can be done. So I think with that, I will transition over to Grace to talk about federal climate.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So in the last really 2 to 3 years, HEAL has slowly started to increase our federal climate work. This is a space that can oftentimes really be dominated by national organizations that don't actually have a local presence in all of the states. You know, it tends to be DC lobbyists who are located out in DC and don't always necessarily have the connections to the people or places they're meant to represent. And it's not just organizations, sometimes congressional staff that can be the same way. Since this work started, you know, I've had plenty of conversations with staffers who have said things like, oh yeah, I came out to Utah once, even though they're supposed to be representing our interests here in Utah. And so we have seen a really significant importance of bringing in a local voice and bringing that to our federal representatives from Utah. So our work in this space has primarily focused on building strong relationships with Utah's congressional offices. And the last couple of years, we've focused mainly on Senator Romney and the former Representative Mick Adams, who is no longer in that seat. But this year, we've actually started to expand our work to Representative Moore, who is a new representative, and Representative Curtis, who has been there for some time now. And not only has HEAL been able to poise ourselves as a reliable and credible on-the-ground organization for these offices to refer to, but we're also able to have, through our relationships with them, really open conversations about their concerns or their support of federal legislation. And really, our whole goal is to try and move the needle on climate action from Utah. And Utah's actually in a really unique position with our congressional delegation to lead on climate from the conservative side. And believe it or not, they are willing to do so, even if in their own way. And HEAL's role has been really to find what that way is, how we can be, you know, putting some public pressure on them. And this is where, you know, our supporters really come in handy through action alerts, making phone calls, doing lobby visits as well, or through just providing information on what's happening at the state legislative session, because they are interested in that, but of course can't pay attention to it since they have a whole federal legislative session happening. Or just in general to be giving them information about, you know, Senator Romney's office will be interested in a certain, you know, technology being researched, and we can help provide that information of who's doing it here in the state. And we've definitely seen, you know, the ability to help nudge the needle a little bit here in Utah. again, when Representative McAdams had been in office, Scott was able to go sit on a panel with him, which was really exciting. We've had lots of meetings directly with McAdams, and then with Senator Romney's office, the ability to just have those open conversations about what they are concerned about, to celebrate when Senator Romney does openly speak about climate change, which is always sometimes a shock, but something we're really excited to see. And even now, Senator Romney is a co-sponsor of the new Growing Climate Solutions Act, which has a little bit more of an agriculture and farming focus related to carbon dividends on it, but he is a co-sponsor of it, and it's something that Representative Curtis has also expressed interest in. So just really, again, finding those ways to be an on-the-ground connection for these federal offices who don't always have that because they're surrounded by folks in DC and are oftentimes out there. So this is something we've been really enjoying and have been prioritizing and growing a lot. And it's been exciting to bring in also grass tops leaders, so just other folks in the communities who can have an influence on our congressional delegation and be bringing them into these conversations and to these meetings. So this is ongoing work and something that we've really enjoyed doing over the last few years, and definitely has been a priority campaign for us that's still even growing today. And I think it's Noah after me. There you go.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for those very detailed overviews. So I will talk about rooftop solar and a cool new program that HEAL is working on. And I really like this picture because this photo, if you can see it, is you can see Michael Shea is the man in the khakis and the blazer on the right, and then I think we have a couple of HEAL supporters on the left. But this is the public comment period and public hearing during the 2017 rooftop solar proceedings, and you can see all the supporters in the back and all the media on the left. So it was kind of a cool moment because that outreach of an outpouring of public support sort of turned the tides of the negotiations right there. So I'll remember that because I was sort of new at HEAL, and it showed the power of working both sides of things, working within negotiations with other stakeholders, and also working public and grassroots support. So it was really cool. But to just back up a little bit, as many of you likely remember, throughout 2016 and 2017, HEAL was involved in the state's major rooftop solar negotiation with Rocky Mountain Power, the solar industry, and the governor's office and other stakeholders under the Public Service Commission. So at the time, Rocky Mountain Power had proposed significant electric rate increases to rooftop solar users based on a study resulting in claims that rooftop solars cost them too much, and that's a line they would continue to tout for the past few years. So at the time, they proposed changes, including reducing the export credit rate, which I'll circle back on because that's another thing that lingered. And the export credit rate is the amount homeowners are paid for adding their excess solar power back to the grid, the system. And they also wanted to add a demand charge and an energy charge for rooftop solar, which would have added so much additional costs to solar customers as proposed that Utah's burgeoning at the time solar industry, we were afraid it was going to be no longer economically sustainable. So like I mentioned, by rallying HEAL supporters and having a seat at the negotiating table, we were able to come to a settlement at the time. And while it was not perfect and it was temporary, it was an improvement upon the original proposed outcome. So there were terms of the settlement, but basically it created an interim period where certain solar owners got to keep their rates, others got an interim rate. So fast forward to when all this reemerged at the end of 2019 and into 2020. The interim period for that settlement ended in the winter of 2020. And Rocky Mountain Power again announced their intention to decrease that export credit by 84% this time, which was just unacceptable. So HEAL Utah and other groups collaborated with customers, citizens, groups, and businesses to oppose this credit decrease that we again feared would destroy the residential rooftop solar market here in Utah. So after a long process at the Public Service Commission, once again, they still lowered the export credit rate, but by significantly less than what Rocky Mountain Power had originally requested. So that export credit is now 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and it's not where we would like it to be. It wasn't the worst possible outcome. And also the Public Service Commission will be revising the export credit annually. It's unlikely to change so much, but we'll continue to stay engaged in that process. And while this export credit is what it is, at least for the time being, we're continuing to explore other ways to make sure that distributed generation like rooftop solar and energy storage at your home and at the commercial site are viable and affordable. So that was not the conclusion of our work on rooftop solar. It was the conclusion of that proceeding. So it'll continue in other ways. But with the culmination of that specific solar proceeding and sort of the stipulations that included HEAL not leading the charge to return to net metering, but boy, you can believe we would like to. We were wondering where to go next to help Utahns have access to affordable rooftop solar. And around this time, we were approached by our friends at Creative Energy's Solar. So that'll bring me into the Solarize, the HEAL Utah Community Solarize program that we're about to launch. So Creative Energies, they're based here in Salt Lake City, and they have operations in 2 other states. So they're a solar company, but they also have other services like storage and things like that. And they're the only certified B Corp, benefit corporation, solar company in the state. So we've worked with them for a long time in the advocacy space, and they've been active in regulatory proceedings and public education. So we've built a good relationship with them based on trust and shared goals. So they proposed partnering for what's known as a Solarize program. And it's pretty unique. So it's a program in which bulk purchasing allows for cheaper installation for prospective homeowners. The goal of this program is to provide HEAL supporters, the people listening today, with cheaper installation services on rooftop solar systems from Creative Energies. So it's not a fundraising partnership. We're not receiving money for each installation or anything, but rather we saw this as a way to guide HEAL supporters who are interested in continuing to get solar, despite what's happening at the state level, towards a company we trust with the opportunity for reduced installation costs, and with reduced installation costs, hopefully a better payback period. So we're still in the process of rolling out this program. So what we'll have to offer you soon is information on our website about the program, and we'll have some FAQs and other relevant information. And then from there, we'll have an application form where you can sign up, and Creative Energies will reach out to you, and they'll figure out if solar is good for your home and basically what the specifics are for that. So feel free to reach out to me on my email, which is on this presentation, but it's noah@healutah.org. And so once again, this is a way we're hoping to help deliver cheaper rooftop solar to HEAL supporters through a company that we trust in Creative Energies. So that's sort of the wrap up on the rooftop solar policy we've been working on for the past couple of years, and also sort of a segue into how we are approaching our relationship with rooftop solar and that relationship with our supporter base going forward.
And I think with that, we'll turn it over to Turner for a minute. We have things that we would like to work on that we don't have the ability to work on, and Turner's going to talk about an opportunity we've been given to expand our reach.
Yeah, so we're doing these presentations in the context of a new capacity campaign that we have been offered. So back in February, we met with a donor that has supported HEAL for a number of years, and we were given the opportunity to do a challenge grant. So between now and August 15th, any donation that we're able to raise through our capacity campaign will be matched, and it goes toward some of the projects and the priorities that we're going to be talking about on the next couple of slides. The idea with our capacity campaign is that HEAL has, as you've seen, a number of responsibilities, a number of roles, and we get pulled in a lot of different directions. And as we have engaged in our work over the past 22 years, that we're bumping up against our own capacity to continue to meet needs, especially in rural areas. So this is all being done under the context of the capacity campaign. If you have the capacity, we would ask you to support financially our goals as we try to grow and create the future of HEAL Utah, which our policy staff will get into shortly.
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Turner. And I will jump into, I'll start off our under-resourced energy and climate campaigns. So much of the above mentioned work has a regulatory component. So I will talk about regulatory intervention as both its own potential campaign and area, but also a really vital component to the existing work that we're doing. So energy and climate policies having to do with generation in Utah frequently go through a really circuitous path through various regulatory agencies in order to become enacted. And this is true for anything related to distributed energy, like the previously mentioned rooftop solar, as well as utility scale generation, like those processes that have to do with retirement or retrofitting technology on Utah's coal units. So it's often a component of other campaigns, but it's a strategy in and of itself, and it's an energy intensive, pun intended, strategy at that. So two ongoing processes that will continue to contribute to the future of Utah's reliance on coal or not include both the integrated resource process known as the IRP and the multi-state process known as the MSP. So these are things that happen at the regulatory level. The decisions are made at the regulatory level. Everything kind of happens on both sides simultaneously. But the IRP is a 20-year roadmap that utilities put together to meet forecasted energy demand using both supply and demand side resources to ensure reliable service to customers in the most cost-effective way. So these occur every 2 years when they're on schedule and present an opportunity to lobby directly for the inclusion of certain renewable resources, for preferred methodology that we think would lead to a better outcome, and to critique variable outcomes, and other pathways for delivering a plan that includes more renewables and storage. So that's one thing that goes on pretty much continually. The MSP, which is sometimes referred to as the coal reassignment process. So PacifiCorp, I mentioned, which owns Rocky Mountain Power and Pacific Power, serves 6 states with common generation and transmission assets. So that's power plants and the transmission lines and substations and everything that share that power. And like I mentioned, it's all an interconnected grid. So allocation agreements are established among states to assign the cost responsibility for those common assets. And as I mentioned earlier, 3 of these states on the West Coast are moving aggressively to remove coal from their portfolio. And this generation will have to go somewhere unless the plants are retired. So the public service commissions in each of these states are set to review and determine future allocations, which could either saddle Utah with more coal moving forward, or the decisions can be made to retire some units. So this is a major process and it's unique. It's not like the IRP, it's not going to happen every 2 years. So we want to ensure that that the outcome is less coal for Utah and not more. So as you can imagine, just by hearing about these 2 processes, intervening in regulatory proceedings is a time and resource intensive process, often requiring hours and hours of poring over dockets, crafting technical arguments, responding to counter arguments by their stakeholders. And really what strong intervention will include is the ability to contribute detailed modeling to bolster the argument, legal assistance from attorneys, and we don't currently have any attorneys on staff, technical analysis to support those things, and like I mentioned earlier, robust public engagement, which HEAL's been pretty strong on usually. So in the past, HEAL has been strong in the communications and public engagement components of proceedings, as exemplified by the rooftop solar docket, but sometimes we need extra help to bring us and our perspective to the next level. And we really want to be strong stakeholders in these processes to make a difference while at the table. And that's something this capacity campaign can help support. So with that, I will pass it on to our next under-resourced campaign, Scott.
Great, thank you, Noah. So Noah talked about the emissions that Utah generates from our coal plants, especially Hunter and Huntington down in Emery County. But Utah contributes to carbon emissions in another way, in another major way, and that is through the oil and gas and coal industry that is predominant out in mostly in eastern Utah. So just for perspective, this map shows the dark sort of purple dots are oil fields, or oil wells, sorry, and the green dots are natural gas wells. And I think up in the upper left corner of this slide is where Salt Lake City is. Over in the far right side of this middle slide is where Vernal is. The pink area that isn't hashed marked is where the Uinta, the Uvare reservation lands, tribal lands are, and then the hashed area is national forest. So it gives you a sense of just how many of these oil and gas wells exist just in that one northeast corner of the state. Utah produces about 85,000 barrels of oil a day. And in 2019, we produced 272 billion cubic feet of natural gas and about 14.5 million short tons of coal. So we generate the raw material, which then goes into these plants and then turns into carbon emissions. And that's part of what HEAL would like to work on more than we have the capacity right now to do. The domestic market in the United States is transitioning away from fossil fuel, as Noah said, even though that's not happening as fast in Utah as we would like. He mentioned examples of other areas of the country where it's happening much more rapidly. So the market for these fossil fuels domestically is starting to dry up. And the local and state officials are now looking for ways to perpetuate this industry in this part of the state. And some of the activities that they've been engaged in to do that are trying to get contracts with the seaports in Oakland and Richmond, California, which are in the Bay Area over there, and then also in Mexico, to agree to develop deep water ports that would allow Utah to ship its fossil fuel to those ports and then send it to Asia for use in those countries. As part of that, there's been the proposal to build a rail spur out of the Uinta Basin that would connect it to the main rail lines of Union Pacific and BNSF, and that would allow them to move this material more quickly and in larger volumes. And that is undergoing an environmental impact study right now. There's several routes that have been proposed. And the state has allowed the use of community impact board funds to support that effort. These are funds that are derived from the extractive industries, and they're intended to support the communities by building community centers and technical schools and other community amenities to offset the negative impacts of extraction. And now those funds are going to be used to actually expand extraction in these areas. In addition, as you can see, a lot of this activity is on tribal lands. And we've had meetings with people in the Ute tribe who are concerned about this, but because of the payments that are given to members of the Ute tribe by these industries, there's not agreement and consensus in the tribe about this. And so HEAL is trying to help facilitate those conversations in order to educate people as much as possible about the negative impacts that this is having in the local environment. In addition to that, many of these wells are leaking methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. And then we're also aware, and Grace, I think, is going to talk in a minute about the fact that there needs to be an economic transition, just as there needs to be where the power plants are, so that cleaner jobs that have more long-term potential can replace the mining and oil well jobs that currently exist in that area. this is something HEAL would really like to be able to put more of our time and resource into, but we just don't have the staff right now to do it. And part of what we're looking to do with the capacity campaign is to expand our bandwidth so that we can focus on this issue in a much more intense way. With that, I think I go back to maybe Noah.
Yep, great. Thanks for that, Scott. So now I'm going to cover regional haze. And this is also something you probably heard us work on. This is actually a campaign that HEAL's been involved in for years now. I consider it an under-resourced campaign due to the window of opportunity I think we find ourselves in and the breadth of the needs of the campaign. So I'll start with a little background. Regional haze is a federal rule within the Clean Air Act that aims to return what are known as Class 1 designated areas to their natural airsheds by 2064. These areas are often national parks, monuments, and wilderness areas, etc. So in Utah, that is our 5 national parks in our southern deserts. So there are major emissions sources in the region that obscure the airsheds in those parks, and this rule aims to clean those emission sources over sort of cascading planning periods, culminating in a return to natural conditions. So the regional haze pollutants in Utah come from major emissions sources like, you guessed it, our friends Hunter and Huntington coal-fired power plants. Those are not the only sources, but they are the largest, and they're consistent with our concerns about the plant's role in climate change as well as regional pollutants. So the primary pollutants that cause regional haze include particulate matters, nitrogen oxides, which I'll just call NOx, sulfur dioxides, which are SO2, and volatile organic compounds, which are I'll just call VOCs. So NOx and SO2 in particular are concerning for their air quality impacts, and we've seen the NOx emissions not really reduced over there at those plants for a long time. So Hunter emits annually about 8,800 tons of NOx per year, and Huntington is close to 6,200 tons per year. So the anthropogenic haze visibility impairment from these pollutants occurs between 70 and 80% of the time throughout the year at those 5 national parks. So while the haze-inducing qualities of these pollutants are concerning and they're at the heart of the regional haze rule and the EPA guidelines in executing that rule, they're sort of secondary to our concerns about the plant's contribution to climate change. So HEAL Utah and other advocates see the regional haze rule as a potential pathway to promote accountability to these polluters who have used our atmosphere as their personal dump for decades, and as a result have never really had to pay the true cost of their operations. So these plants are economically viable in part because they use the sky as a dump, and that's not really how we think it should work. So the technical analysis of the coal plants and the regional haze emissions done by HEAL and our allies have demonstrated that, and this is sort of widely known in this world, that a technology called selective catalytic reduction is the best available way to reduce those NOx emissions in a way that's consistent with the goals of the regional haze rule. So how that process works is during the combustion process, the nitrogen that is naturally present in the coal and the nitrogen and oxygen present in the combustion air combine to form NOx. Prior to being released into the atmosphere, like they currently are, the exhaust gases pass through a large catalyst, where the NOx reacts with the catalyst and ammonia and is converted into nitrogen and water. So that process typically removes 80 to 90% of the NOx that is in the exhaust of a coal-fired power plant. So that technology needs to be retrofitted and paid for, at least in part, by the plant's owners, which in this case is PacifiCorp. And the problem for PacifiCorp is that these plants, their economic feasibility really starts to teeter when factoring in this technology. So they would either need to swallow the cost or retire the plants entirely. And that part right there is really where we see why this process is important. So the state is tasked with developing a state implementation plan, or a SIP, and this must be accepted by the EPA as being consistent with the regional haze rule. So we've been through a few rounds of this in the past decades, and mostly due to the influence of polluters, the state has submitted a couple of weak plans that have been rejected by the EPA. But the most recent plan that was initially rejected by the EPA and is sort of a business as usual plan with no real NOx reduction coming from Hunter and Huntington in this way. This was at first rejected by the EPA, but in a last move by the Trump administration was approved in late 2020. So HEAL is currently participating in a legal challenge, citing a violation of the EPA's own guidance on the regional Haze rule. So this is in progress now, and the hoped for outcome is a ruling that reverses the order on that rule. But while this is happening, Utah is entering what's known as round 2 of regional Haze, which is supposed to be the next step in our plan to reduce these emissions. So Utah's regional Haze for the SIP, that plan they're coming up with for the second period, was due at the end of July this year, but due to multiple delays, a draft won't be likely until October. So while HEAL is engaged in this, there is more we can do to ensure that a friendly EPA makes the right decision and hopefully mandates SCR technology on these plants. So HEAL operating at its highest capacity in this campaign would include engaging the state of Utah and the Division of Air Quality with compelling technical analysis, stating our case with these emissions sources, legal assistance to guide arguments favoring our preferred outcome, increased organizing capacity to elevate relevant voices near Utah's national parks and gateways communities. And those are a lot of rural areas, which Scott mentioned are hard to organize in. And we'd also be maximizing public engagement through traditional and paid media. So we have a window of opportunity with this current planning process, the ongoing legal challenge, and an EPA that is more likely to be sympathetic with efforts to reduce regional Haze and climate changing emissions rather than siding with polluters. And it is my hope that this is a pathway for making movement on the retirement of those plants. And I just keep on rambling, so I'm going to pass it off to Grace.
Yeah, thanks, Noah. And I do want to be conscious of leaving a little bit of time for questions. So this will be pretty short, but this is something that HEAL Utah thinks is a really, really important priority. And everything that we talked about today can't happen or shouldn't happen without a just transition. For those who are unfamiliar with a just transition, essentially it's the equitable shift from a fossil fuel economy to a diverse, sustainable, and long-term clean energy economy that will provide good, well-paying, and sustainable jobs for the communities that are impacted. So like coal communities or the communities out in the Uinta Basin that Scott was talking about. It's not as simple as retire a coal plant, put a solar farm there, and let everyone work there. It's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. And the biggest factor is that the communities impacted actually have to be part of that conversation. And with HEAL, we're all along the Wasatch Front, and so we're not well connected into those communities. And so part of why we want to up this campaign and make it a larger priority is to be able to actually travel, post-pandemic safely to those communities and start building trust, learning what these communities need, what their priorities are, and ensuring that they have a seat at the table during this transition away from fossil fuels. And we can't, again, make the transition without bringing the communities along with us and putting them in the center of it. So again, it's much more complicated than that, but we just need the resources to make sure that we're in the communities and that they are being heard and that this transition is happening with the community's best interest in mind. And I'll pass it to Turner.
Right. So just as a reminder, as we close out, donations are being matched through August 15th. You can donate online at healutah.org/give. Basically, the goal of the campaign is to expand our fundraising base. So we're very grateful for the support that we've received throughout the years. We have many long-standing donors, including last year, who stepped up and helped us reach our financial goals. And we want to make sure that we acknowledge that support. We're hoping that you will support us as we work to expand our work and grow into the future of HEAL. I believe there was a question in the chat, and so I want to make sure that we leave time for those questions. But again, you can donate at healutah.org/give, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. My email is right there, and my cell phone is right there, so you can reach out to me directly. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Turner. And we do have a couple of minutes before the end of the hour. If there are any questions, and I saw Kathy asked one in the chat, and you asked what other areas in the US do HB 411 type programs, and that HB 411 is what we mentioned earlier, the Community Renewable Energy Program, in which a couple of dozen cities have gotten together to negotiate 100% renewable energy. So this program is sort of unique in the US in that it is a coalition of communities negotiating together with the utility to formulate what that transition looks like, and it was done through legislation. So there are some standalone cities in the US out there that do this, and that's initially what Salt Lake City and Park City were doing before. But this process is unique in that it's that coalition of cities negotiating all at once, and it's going to be a sort of a inter-community program in partnership with the utility rather than a single entity renegotiating its franchise agreement or just individually. So the hope is that if and when this is successful, it can create a blueprint for other coalitions of cities to be able to follow suit in the future, and that the hard work is done in doing more of like a wholesale version of this rather than just being up to individual cities to come up with their own resources. A lot of the cities that Scott mentioned earlier, they're really small and wouldn't be able to do this if it wasn't for that coalition approach. So it's unique, and hopefully we'll see it replicated elsewhere.
And Noah, I put their website in the chat, utah100communities.org. There's a lot of really good information about the program there for people who want to learn more about it.
Yeah, I would encourage you to visit. And Scott, I think there's a good question for either you or Turner from Bob.
Yeah, so Bob Archibald asked if any and all of the donations will be matched. As Turner said, we have the challenge of raising our annual budget, as we always do, and then this is a matching grant on top of that. Right now, we're really focused on the capacity campaign, and so if you go to that website, healutah.org/give, that will directly send these donations into the capacity campaign match, and we'll be able to use those to match the foundation pledge. And then later in the year, when we normally do our fall party and our annual end of year appeal, is when we'll be trying to top off our annual fund to keep us going at the capacity we have now. And we already actually have received grants and other donations that have gotten us a fair way there. So we're feeling really good about it. It's just, this is an extra effort we're doing to try to match this $120,000 by August 15th.
Great, thanks, Scott. And I know we threw out on the Instagram the other day if there were any questions from the public. So if any of those cycled through and thought were good, Mesa, you can let me know about those. If not, I think we're just about over the hour. So I
think the only ones from Instagram, we had some people ask what some kind of, let me pull it up really quick. What are some things that they can do on a personal level to kind of help out with these different campaigns?
Yeah, that's perfect. And, you know, each campaign is unique. And the good thing about volunteering with HEAL Utah is that since each campaign is unique and the needs are varied from volunteers, we can really suit each volunteer to their strengths and the needs of the campaigns. So if you're interested in volunteering on any of these campaigns, I would reach out to our grassroots organizer, Carmen Valdez at carmen@healutah.org. And then really at the heart of our conversation today is bolstering HEAL's work through the generous donations of existing supporters and new supporters. So a financial contribution to help expand this work is always appreciated as well. But Mesa, we'll take note and we'll reach back out to those individuals and have those conversations.
Thank you, Noah. I think we're about ready to sign off, but before we do, I just want to mention that this presentation will be on our YouTube channel and available for you to share with people that you might want to introduce to HEAL and our work. as well as the presentation we did last week on radioactive waste and our work in that area. And then 1 week from today at the same time, we'll be doing our final campaign update presentation on our air quality work. So thank you so much for joining us. Please let your friends know about the work that HEAL's doing, and hopefully we'll see you all next Thursday when we talk about air quality.
Great, thanks so much.